Any questions? Any questions? Yes, please.
Process data after, or process index after process data. I read somewhere in the, I think, SQLug documentation that you have to do run like full processing every now and then just to avoid disk fragmentation. Is it still true, or they recommend you have to use process data and process index regularly, but every now and then use a full processing?
Well, that's a recommendation, but it's not quite exactly the way you said it. Process data and process indexes is identical to process full. And so you can do this all the time. That's not a problem. What is a problem is using process add, which isn't available in the interface. And because it's not available in the interface, I don't know how many people are using it. It also doesn't work well. The Microsoft people say it doesn't work as well as it should. Let me put it off for the Microsoft folks. They say it doesn't work as well as it should, and they're hoping they can make it work better in future editions. But people do use process update. You process to a process update on a dimension, then you don't have to process any of the cubes that use that. But if you're using process update or process add on your dimensions, the recommendation is that you still use process full on a periodic basis. And the last 3 weeks, I heard one Microsoft person say, try to do it at least once a week. I heard another Microsoft person say, try to do it at least once every 1 or 2 years. So again, it depends. It depends on how often to do it. But the thing is, whenever you do a process update or a process add on your dimensions, you lose some of the efficiency. It's kind of they compare it to a fragmentation in a file system. And specifically on process update, if any dimension values are deleted, they're left in there, but they're marked as being deleted. And so you actually have more members in there than there really are, and that over time you can lose efficiency because of that. So that's the point. Process add or process update on a dimension, you do want to do a process full on a periodic basis. That doesn't apply here. Process data and process indexes does give you a full process. It just divides the full process into its separate components. Yes?
I have a question about write-back cubes. What's your experience? I have a customer who wants to write back their forecast and so on.
Right. Write-back cubes. I have, let's see, I have not done that directly myself. I have worked with I've worked with a client who was doing it, though. I mean, I have seen it being done. I guess we did not cover that in the course, which is interesting. It was not talked about at all. How many of you are doing write-back? Have you done write-back or are doing it now?
I tried, but then I felt that didn't feel secure.
It what?
I didn't feel secure with it. I felt that I better write it to a table instead. And I have one customer that wants to write back to cubes. But as you see, I have no experience with it.
Right.
And there must be a reason for it, but no one does it.
Right. Well, what is it? It's kind of tricky. And it can hurt performance too if you don't merge your write-back partition back into your regular partitions on a regular basis. You can get a lot of write-backs, which they can hurt performance. I mean, it's until they get merged back in, and when you merge them back in, you have to merge the relational records back in separately. So it does take a while to get, it takes a while to get used to doing it, and there are performance challenges with it. So my experience is that it really is a fairly small minority of folks that are doing cube write-back. Other questions?
Regarding the BISM and the UDM model, will there be any tool to convert from BISM to UDM, or in the next version of SQL Server? Do you know that?
Is there any tool to convert from BISM to UDM, or from UDM to BISM, I suppose, or to convert back and forth? I'm feeling a little ignorant about that. I do know of, I know people who are trying it, who are converting them, but is there a tool to do it? Does anybody know? Is there? I know, the next version of SQL Server, I mean, in the business, in the BIDS, in the Business Intelligence Development Studio, you're going to be able to work both with the UDM and with BISM kind of side by side. So they're both going to be there. I know one of the things that I know was said by the SQL CAT team involved in the Maestro course is they would like to see people, as a case study, they'd like to see people do a conversion from the UDM structure over to the BISM just to compare how they perform and what the experience is in changing from one to the other. But yeah, I don't. That's a good question, and it seems like there should be a tool for it, but I don't know. Anybody else? We had a question raised at the break about slowly changing dimensions, which is kind of a favorite topic of mine. I gave a presentation at PASS, I think 8 or 9 years ago about that. And I like to say, Ralph Kimball, one of the first people who wrote about data warehousing, well, maybe the second person who wrote about data warehousing, but Ralph, he has a section on slowly changing dimensions, and he talks about the 3 types of slowly changing dimensions. And I think he just made that up, and of course everybody's been talking about 3 types ever since. But the fact is that what I said before about, I think people really think in this OLAP type of way. I mean, I think that's kind of our way of thinking. We don't think in a relational model. So one of the big challenges we all face is how do we take this relational model and how do we bring it over and force it into our OLAP model? I mean, it does have to be forced. A star schema, whether you're snowflaking or whatever you're doing with it, a star schema is much more restrictive than a regular relational model. You've got to push things into the model. And dimension change is a particular area that just doesn't fit. It just doesn't work. The type 1 dimension change is you just change the value. Well, so you destroy the history when you change an attribute value in a dimension. If a customer moves to a new city and you put he moves from Stockholm to, well, where do people in Stockholm move to? I mean, they probably never want to move anywhere, but they move to another city. And so then you just change the city where this person lived. Well, if this person had a sale last year, it's a sale to somebody in Stockholm. But now you look at the sales, and that sale from last year will look like it's a sale to somebody in Malmö, So you've destroyed the historical value of your cube anytime you do a dimension 1 change. You've destroyed your history. And I don't care. I mean, you say, well, it wasn't that important. Well, why are we browsing these things if it's not important? I mean, you've wrecked your history. You do a type 2 change. A type 2 change is you add a new record in for this customer. The customer moves from Stockholm to Malmö. You add a new record in. Well, then you browse it, and you find these are 2 different customers. One, a customer lives in Stockholm, a customer lives in Malmö. You destroy continuity across time when you do a type 2 change. And then he had this type 3 change, which nobody ever does. It just doesn't work. So, you know, type 3 change is you add a new field or something into the structure. I mean, it's just, you could do it on an occasional basis, but it's absolutely impractical as a regular strategy for a dimension change. Now, what I proposed in my presentation 8-9 years ago is, and of course it's not just me proposing it, Ralph Kimball has something similar and other people do, is that you really should, if you have a dimension change, you really should consider splitting the dimension into 2 parts. If you have a customer dimension and maybe have a demographic dimension, so or maybe a customer geography dimension. So if you have a customer that moves from Stockholm to Malmö, it's still the same customer, but it's a different key for customer geography. It's somebody that lives, you know, so you have a sale to this guy last year. He has the Stockholm key and the customer key. He's a sale this coming year. It'll be the Malmö customer geography key, but it'll still be the same customer key. So you divide the dimension into the parts that change and the parts that don't change. And so then you work around it. But, you know, obviously, that also doesn't work if it happens too often, you know. I mean, if you have too many changes, too many different types of dimension change, that doesn't work either. So it really comes down to a business decision. What's important to your business users? You know, I've had a lot of projects where you use type 1 changes, and you say, well, you know, this really, I mean, you're really wrecking your history here. It's really not valid for browsing back into time. And the answer comes back, well, we really don't care. We want to see what's happening the current month anyway. So, okay, you know, a type 1 change is the easiest. And so you just go ahead and do it. You just go ahead and make your changes. If you are doing that, one of the things that helps with analysis services is maybe you try to bunch those changes together so that you don't have type 1 changes every day. Because you have type 1 changes, you have to do a process update. Maybe each day you do a process add, if you're into the process add thing, and then on the weekends you do process update, you know, just to hold down your processing time. I guess I just kind of as an aside about that, you know, I've tried to use process update and process in various situations. Thomas Kaiser was really, I mean, he kind of challenged us last week. He said, why do you bother with process update and process add? Just do a process full. You know, just do process full all the time. Well, but that, of course, won't work if your cubes are real big. So, I mean, there's, you know, but then, of course, you could partition and only process full on a part of it. Well, you know, there's a bunch of strategies with that. So anyway, I don't know who asked about the changing dimension issue, but I mean, it's a fascinating one. It's a fascinating problem. There's never a good answer to changing dimensions because, again, we're forcing data to do something into our OLAP model, which our OLAP model is very useful. It's the way people think, but the data doesn't really fit into that model. I mean, that's my opinion about it. Do you have anything more to say about that?
No, thanks.
Oh, yeah. It's just
Thanks for answering, though.
yeah. Other issues? Other questions? Yes.
Can extended events be used to monitor SS analysis, or is that only for SQL Server?
Extended events. Extended events in analysis server. Yeah. Are there extended events in analysis server? That's not an analysis server feature as far as I know. If anybody knows differently, please speak up. But no, that's not a. But again, in terms of monitoring, I mean, in terms of what's going on, you know, there's a lot of ways to monitor. Well, you know, the profiler, of course, and the performance monitor, but really, you You know, if you ever do get to take this Maestro course, and before taking the course, it's good to know how to use the profiler and the performance monitor really well, because we use it a lot. And both of them can be used interactively. You know, you can open up the profiler and see what's happening, or the performance monitor and see what's happening. But both of them are actually more useful when you save data and look at it later. You save a trace, or you save a performance monitor log. And then, of course, you can load the information, say, from the profile. You can load it into a database table, which allows you to query and so forth. But the other tool for monitoring are these data management views, and they're brand new. Well, they're new with 2008, and there's additional ones that have been added in 2008 R2. They give you a huge amount of information you can query. I mean, they're SQL-like queries. It's SQL format, but limited. I mean, you can't. There's a bunch of SQL features you can't use with them. That's, of course, you know, what I showed, that resource monitor cube that uses those queries. And if you go into the one of the things about the resource monitor is, if you go into the data source view of the resource monitor, you will see how to use the data, these views, to get all sorts of information back from the server. One of the problems with monitoring is that it's been hard to, you know, the profiler gives you the information about individual queries being run. The performance monitor gives you information about the state of the server while you're running the queries or the processing operations. You can put those two together, but it's been a challenge to know what resources are being taken by an individual query. But you know, the very newest version, in fact, and I haven't even tried this yet, just a few weeks ago, Cumulative Update 6 for Analysis Server 2008 R2 added additional events and columns that can be used in the profiler to analyze the system resources being used by an individual query. So you can see that documented in the Cumulative Update. It looks very interesting. I have not had a chance to try that yet, but it is one of the challenges we've always had, is that we're running all these queries and we're seeing what's happening on the server, but it's hard to associate an individual query with particular resources that are being used. But Cumulative Update 6, which has been out just, what, 3-4 weeks, is, you know, has additional tools there. So, yes, please.
You spoke before about having invoice number as a dimension, and the purpose was to achieve a helper for drill through. But it makes the invoice dimension very big and too big.
Right.
And what strategy to achieve drill through and but skip the dimension or invoice number dimension?
You know, it is actually one place that that people do use rollup right now, is that they will use rollup for a fact dimension or a degenerate dimension. And let's see, how do you do that? You do a separate. I'm trying to think. I actually helped implement this once, but I try to remember how to do it. I think you do a separate measure group with a rollup. Yeah, you have a separate measure group that you're doing that includes that dimension, that degenerate dimension, that fact dimension, with with a whole pile of members, and you do that in rollup, so you're not having to store all that into in your MOLAP structure, so you don't have to take all the time to process that or all the space to process it. Then you make that invisible so people can't see it, but you give them access to it through drill through. And so then, of course, the drill through queries go back to the relational store. And is somebody done? Have you done that?
One issue is that only numbers are accepted in the fact tables, and sometimes a number might include some alphabetic things like A, B, 10, 10. And then you have a problem storing them in the fact tables, because measure groups can only include numeric values. And that's not
measure groups, right? Measures can only be numeric values. Right, right. But you could have a value in a fact table and make it into a separate dimension. And that's, of course, what's called a, well, Ralph Kimball calls it a degenerate dimension. Microsoft calls it a fact dimension. But but if you do that in ROLAP, then you can use it for drill through. But don't let people see it, because you'll really have poor performance if you're browsing it. So, yeah. Workarounds, workarounds, workarounds. Yes, please.
You were talking about performance. How about Hyper-V and the virtual server? And then you can easily keep more memory and more CPUs. How about performance in that environment?
With using Hyper-V, using analysis services on Hyper-V? The main problem with using Hyper-V is the limit on the number of processors. Is that what you're talking about, or is it?
No, I mean, is it good or bad to use virtual servers?
Oh, to use virtual servers, yeah. Oh, okay. Is it good or bad to use virtual servers with analysis server? My understanding is that there is not a lot of information about that either way yet. In terms of whether analysis server is works well, or how comparison using analysis server on virtual servers or not. Except that, again, with Hyper-V, there's a maximum of 4 processors that can be assigned to, in the current version of Hyper-V. And so you cannot take advantage of, again, analysis server works better with the more processors there are, the more cores there are, up until 32. After that, there's diminishing returns for adding in more processors. For see, what is this? It's I believe it's for cube processing. Analysis server can use up to 64 cores efficiently, but for querying, it can only use 32 cores. Oh, of course, and there's one other detail on that. For doing formulas, for evaluating calculations, it only uses 1 processor. For calculations are single-threaded in analysis services, which, I mean, that's really, it's a huge limitation in this era of having more and more data. This is kind of an aside, but one of the things that we did last week was, again, we were in London, and we had some very prominent folks there in the class, and Thomas Kaiser spent a couple hours going away from our course material, and he said, "What would you like to see as the improvements in analysis services that are most needed?" And they spent a couple hours discussing that and then voting on it. And the #1 voting thing was that we should be able to multi-thread the processor, or the computation engine, the formula engine in analysis services. Because as we get to have bigger and bigger cubes and more complex queries, that's a huge bottleneck. And as servers are having more and more processors these days, I mean, that's the change. We're getting better and better hardware, but if it all has to, when it comes to actually doing the calculation, it all has to funnel through a single processor, then you've lost the the value of having your multiple processors. But that's an issue with Hyper-V too, is that a maximum of 4 processors, when you could go off and you could send 32 processors off to retrieve data from all the different segments. You can have all these different threads. If you just have 4 processors, you're limiting. That's a very significant limitation on your hardware at the present time. Okay, this is great. Yes, please.
Are there any new features in SQL Server 2011 to be excited about that you can tell us about?
Well, when Microsoft hired me to do this, to write this course, I thought, well, now I'm really going to be an insider. But they really didn't tell me very much, actually. I was disappointed. I thought I would get a lot of inside information. I really can't. I really don't have anything to say about that for analysis services. It's no, I don't know, and of course. With all the news is about BISM, which of course again is a thing that's made some of us a little depressed. But we hope that some of these other things will be worked on and will get on in maybe in that version, or of course maybe in the versions after it. But because there are some things that analysis services has been around for a while, and it's basically it was very much rewritten with 2005. But since 2005, there wasn't much change with 2008. There's not a lot of change with 2008 R2. It's really that they've improved things around the edges. They've improved querying a lot with the block computation stuff. There's other pretty obvious query improvements, well, such as the one I showed you. If we can take a view and inline it and improve performance enormously, why can't the optimizer do the same thing? That's not rocket science. We can just do cut and paste. The query optimizer inside of analysis services should be able to do that also. And so, I expect there will be things like that. Things that they know about, but there are little bottlenecks that I hope they'll get around to fixing. But we'll see. Nothing's really been, as far as I know, there's nothing that, real big that's been announced. Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, invite me back to Sweden someday, and